There's always been something oddly appealing to me about Adventure Time's 6th season. I'm still not sure if I'd call it the show's best, with the following two, as well as Fiona and Cake, all being so stellar, but I spend a lot of time thinking about this collection of episodes. This probably isn't a surprise to you. I mean, I've made several videos talking up the likes of Breezy and You Forgot Your Floaties. I mean, hell, the majority of videos I've made this year about the show have been on this season, but I've never actually talked about the ending of it, and that's mostly because I find a good chunk of it to be pretty mediocre. Martin is significantly more interesting as a concept than a character, the King of Ooh never quite becomes symbolic enough to overcome his inherent goofiness, Orgalorg is sneakily one of the biggest misses I think the show ever had, and it all just culminates in a story that feels pretty disconnected from everything else in the series, something that fits quite well with common criticisms of the season as a whole. But that's not quite what we're going to be talking about today. See, while large parts of the final chunk of season 6 might be a bit underwhelming, there is a 7 or so minute stretch in the finale that contains some of the most interesting dialogue that the series ever produced, as Finn meets the Catalyst Comet, and that's what we're going to explore in this video. So buckle in as we dive into some of the most abstract yet touching writing that Adventure Time ever had to offer.
I am Orgalorg!
Whoa.
Somewhat inherently, given this episode's status as a season finale, there's a lot of plot and lore stuff tucked within here, as the show wraps up its somewhat vague seasonal arc. So, as much as I would love to just read the Adventure Time Wiki to you, I'm instead gonna trust you guys to do that by yourself, and instead focus on the more thematic elements of this quarter hour. Subsequently, given just how focused this video is going to be on the dialogue, I will be putting most of what I'm talking about on screen, so it might be worth glancing at your device a bit more than usual. Finally, before actually getting into this video, I think it's important to acknowledge that this episode is one of the many in the show boarded in part by Jesse Moynihan. And while he is almost certainly my favorite of the storyboard artists in the show, with his episodes very consistently making up a good chunk of my very favorites, his writing style definitely tends to be the least concrete of anybody on the team. And while this is somewhat apparent in his more grounded episodes, like Germain or Skywitch, in his more astral work, for lack of a better term, some of the dialogue definitely borders on incomprehensible. So all of that being said, if you do think there's something here that I interpret entirely incorrectly, you may very well be right. Anyway, all of that secondary preamble out of the way, let's finally get into this episode. And while I will reference a few bits from before this moment later in the video, I actually want to first focus on this line from Finn, as after being stranded in space, he mentions, quote, croaking like a fish in the hands of a child. This is actually a moment that the final seconds of this episode will reference, and I think it paints a pretty clear picture of one of the biggest things that this episode will ultimately be about. The idea of being hopelessly at the whim of things you can't control. This is something that's all over this episode, from Finn referencing Jake's cosmic owl dream that seems to forcefully be coming true, to his conversation with Martin over whether or not Orgalorg ever had a choice to be evil. There's just this general undercurrent of discussion about how much of an impact one can actually have on how their life turns out. And I think it's the episode's response to this that makes this entire quarter hour kind of feel like nothing else in animation. See, this is a topic that a good chunk of cartoons tackle, with so many animated protagonists fighting against their predetermined destiny and overcoming the biggest of challenges. And yes, Adventure Time is about to do that exact same thing, but I do think they tackle it in a slightly more interesting way. Here, take a quick look at Finn's quick song, and I think you'll quickly kind of see what I mean here. As while Finn does certainly make a plea for things to turn out differently than they appear to be, it's pretty hard to describe this as him pledging to fight against it. There's just this layer of acceptance, this peace and understanding that he'll never have complete control that feels almost antithetical to the general cartoon theme of fight for the future that you want. This is something that the end of the episode touches on too, with PB's comments about everything pretty much just being 50-50. No matter how hard you try, no matter how much effort you put in, some things will just never work out. I'll touch on this more in a second, but I really don't think that this is the episode establishing that giving up is the best option in the face of a seemingly insurmountable challenge. Just more so a concession that sometimes it's best to acknowledge your inability to make everything behave exactly the way you want it to. This is, of course, the perfect segue to the next character to show up in this one, Martin. Now, I know my comments on him earlier in this video almost certainly need some explanation, so here we go. I really think the decision to make somebody like Martin the father of Finn was one of the most interesting that this show ever made, and I also think that a good chunk of the audience don't quite understand why this is the case. I'm aware that a certain miniseries that I may or may not be constantly promising to eventually cover plays a big role in why people believe this, and I don't think that you're some type of horrible fan if you do as well, but I'll never quite get the desire to want Martin to be any sort of sympathetic figure. This idea that he has some good in his heart that either eroded over time or went away when he hit his head or whatever just feels antithetical to the role that the character played while he was still present in the show. Evidence against Finn's belief that all people are good. When our protagonist learns that his father is this cartoonishly self-centered being, it's this complete shock to his system, one symbolized by him losing his arm. The fundamentally good world he believed he inhabited just doesn't exist, and the Finn that we see for the rest of the series after this point just isn't the same guy because of it. And it's this idea that the episode uses Martin to explore. In short, the Martin of this episode sucks, and it's also probably my favorite use of the character. I mean, he's obviously always been an asshole, and his actions in previous episodes arguably have been worse, but there's just never been a time where his words feel as apathetic or just frustrating as here. Even with limited screen time in this quarter-hour episode, Martin still finds time to be constantly telling Finn how out of his hands everything is, how uninvolved he is in any meaningful way. If there was any part of you that felt as if this episode was endorsing the idea of just giving up and accepting your shitty reality, then the way they portray Martin here should quickly dispel that. Ultimately, though, Martin's impact in this episode is largely based on his final decision within it, as he decides to take the titular Comet's offer to essentially leave reality. A choice that both makes entire sense for the character, as the ultimate shirking of responsibility, and a decision that just rocks the audience and the protagonist. Everybody here knows that there isn't any coming back from this moment. If Martin chooses to bail on everything, he'll be giving up his opportunity to ever become a quote-unquote better person. Finn quickly figures this out too, launching into a final plea, but at least this time, Martin doesn't let him waste his breath. First giving him the truthful advice that there's nothing he can say to explain himself, and then immediately launching back into some meaningless garbage talk. The latter of which seemingly being what finally gets things to click for Finn. Throughout their time together, even as Martin repeatedly did shitty things to his son that Finn seemed to eventually accept, it's not until this moment that our protagonist finally and truly stops trying to change his father. There's no more pleas, no more hope, just recognition of what is and what will never be. Finn's father was a selfish man, one who only ever cared about others when convenient, and there's no amount of squirming that will ever take that burden away from Finn. This scene is obviously not quite a cheery one, but I do think there's a silver lining at the end here, as Finn does finally feel the freedom of no longer holding on to this idea of having a good father. No longer waiting for something he was just never destined to have. You've likely noticed that I've skipped a big chunk of this episode, and while that's partially because I didn't want to have to end this episode on the absolute bummer that I just talked about, I do think that the conversation this video's title references is ultimately what I want to wrap things up with. After Finn somewhat anticlimactically takes out Orgolorg, with the only interesting thing being the creature's final line, which references and somewhat diminishes Jake's mention of the open door philosophy from earlier in the episode, we then get about 2 minutes of a conversation between Finn and the Catalyst Comet, and holy shit do I love it. Seriously, I know I've been negative about a good chunk of the circumstances surrounding this episode, but this scene has to be in the top 5 or so that the series ever produces. And while a good chunk of this just comes from the general aesthetics, with the sound design and atmosphere here just being unbelievably top notch, the biggest contributor to this comes through just how strangely and beautifully this back and forth is written. After the conversation begins with Finn remembering/realizing that he was the Catalyst Comet in a past life, the current Comet offers him a deal: escape his current reality and travel time and space in blissful perpetuity instead. And it's the way that this is portrayed to the audience that has caused this moment to stick with me so damn well. The way that life is described here is something that only this show could pull off, as existence is framed as both a temporary, absurd struggle and the culmination of everything that's possibly worth living for. This idea is best hammered in by perhaps the most iconic moment of this episode, with the Comet presenting Finn with several facets of life, each of which accompanied by a representation of such within his life. And while there is certainly a degree of joy associated with just seeing all these characters that we love so much, I think the bigger impact comes in Finn's reaction to seeing all of this. When looking at the list of things that are presented to him, nearly half of them are explicitly bad. The show isn't exactly subtle in what this means either, presenting this pretty clearly as Finn's existential crisis. Should he continue to live and allow everything out of his control to affect him so much, or take a more nihilistic approach and escape the mode of existence that allows one to get hurt in the first place? Should he open himself up to a world that's going to cause him pain in unpredictable, unpreventable ways, or just not? Unfortunately, by this point, the episode has already spent a bit too much time on Orgolor shenanigans to really let Finn bask in this decision, but I don't think that does terribly much to reduce the impact that this has on the audience. Obviously, Adventure Time has overcome its Cartoon Network audience to touch on mature themes before, but there's very little they've done that hits as hard as this, forcing their protagonist to choose between a life full of joy and suffering or a life full of nothing. A life where you allow uncontrollable forces to dictate how you feel, or a life where you feel nothing at all. Finn, of course, has to choose the former for us to continue to get a show, and they do pretty quickly have to get to that Martin stuff I talked about, but there still is some time for some dialogue here that I absolutely love. Starting with this line, where immediately after hearing his life itemized, Finn declares it good. Sure, nobody is going to make the argument that things like violence or scoundrels are ideal, but he sees the culmination of it all as worth living for. I skipped past it earlier, but in that first conversation with Martin, there's also a quick line that alludes to this. When his father declares that space is pretty much empty, Finn responds by arguing that, even in the abyss, there's still stars. Even in a world full of evil, Finn desires to still exist for the pockets of good within. This episode, at times, certainly feels thematically all over the place, likely as a result of Moynihan's occasional apathy towards audience understanding, but I kind of think it all comes together for Finn's subsequent comment, and one of my favorite lines from the entire series. All throughout this quarter hour, there's been this constant clash of both the need to accept what you can't change and the decision decision to still connect to this world in spite of how randomly unfair it may or may not be. But I believe this moment to fully address both of these seemingly opposite perspectives. No matter what you think about this reality, or what this reality seems to think about you, it's ultimately all you'll ever have. If you give up on it, you've given up on everything, so you might as well see what you can get from it.
I feel like I put a lot of work into this meat reality. I'd like to see it through.
Anyway, that's about it for me. I know this one was a bit heavier than usual, but I just happened to re-stumble upon this episode and needed to talk about it. If you want to see some of my lighter thoughts on animation, you can find me where the skies are blue. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll hopefully see you relatively soon for the Raven video. For real this time. Thanks for watching.